Okay, I think we're going to get started this evening. Welcome, everyone. We have some people still coming in, so as you all come in, we're glad you're joining us. I'm pleased to have you be with us this evening for the final lecture of our Fall 2021 series, Maker and Muse, Sculpting the Gilded Age. I am Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator. And I have to say, it's been a true joy to work with each of our speakers that we've been bringing to you with their fascinating stories of sculptors and their muses as part of this limited series. Tonight we are on Zoom only, so I'm happy to say also that we'll be able to facilitate Q&A from our Zoom participants following the conclusion of our speakers' remarks. So if you please enter your questions into the Q&A feature, you can do that during the talk as well as afterwards, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We hope you've enjoyed this series, particularly in that it has been brought to you free of charge. So the Preservation Society of Newport County welcomes you to support our mission through a donation of any amount, which allows us to continue bringing these wonderful subjects to you. We are also welcoming you to visit our website, newportmansions.org, to learn more about ways to visit the Newport Mansions, including our upcoming Return of Sparkling Lights, which is the outdoor light program at the Breakers, and that debuts November 20th. We will be having a winter lecture series beginning probably in late January 2022, so please stay tuned for those schedules as they become available. On to our lecture this evening. Julie Aronson has served as Curator of American Paintings, Sculpture, and Drawings at the Cincinnati Art Museum since 1999. She earned her BA in Art History from Brandeis University, an MA from Williams College, and a PhD from the University of Delaware. She is the recognized authority on the sculpture of Bessie Vonnoh that we'll be hearing about this evening. And it was the subject of her doctoral dissertation and a 2008 touring exhibition and catalog. Her professional experience includes prior positions at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri, the National Gallery of Art, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, both in Washington, D.C. Dr. Aronson was a key member of the curatorial team that produced the groundbreaking display, The Cincinnati Wing, the story of art in the Queen City. And she also co-curated the exhibition Perfect Likeness, European and American Portrait Miniatures from the Cincinnati Art Museum with its landmark catalog. Her other curatorial projects include the exhibition and catalog Eternal Summer, The Art of Edward Henry Pottis, and most recently, Frank Duveneck, American Master, presented with a new scholarly publication in 2020. That's not a short list of accomplishments, and we're so grateful to have the authority on Bessie Vonnoh with us tonight. So without further delay, welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to be with you virtually from this beautiful crisp fall day in Cincinnati. And I would especially like to thank Leslie Jones for her planning of this wonderful event. I've enjoyed revisiting Bessie Vonnoh. I haven't spoken about her in a little while. Women sculptors are still a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. They remain underrepresented in the literature of American art history and in our exhibitions. And there are many wonderful sculptors who have yet to be rediscovered, thoroughly studied, and introduced to the public. Programs like this one make an important contribution to getting the word out. So I really thank the Preservation Society of Newport County for organizing this wonderful series. Here she is. We'll return to her in a moment. This was taken in about 1895 or 96. So setting the scene for Vonnoh's work are the late 19th century's mind-boggling social and cultural changes, such as the explosive growth of cities, such as Chicago, where she grew up, huge waves of immigration, the births of new technologies, and the growth of industrial fortunes. It's a period of growing internationalism, reflected in and stimulated by the world's fairs, and the founding of innumerable American cultural institutions, such as universities, libraries, art schools, and museums. The women's suffrage movement gained momentum, and increasing numbers of women entered the workforce in both working class and professional capacities. And as a result, as in other fields of endeavor, women entered the sculpture profession in record numbers. The photograph I'm showing you here is a sculpture class at the Art Institute of Chicago from about 1890, which is when Vonnoh was there, except she is not in this particular class. I kept hoping I'd find a photo of a class with her in it, but that didn't happen. But you can see that there was quite a group of women sculptors in this photograph. For most of the 19th century, marble was the preferred medium for sculpture, and the style was neoclassical, based on ancient Greek and Roman prototypes and associations of antiquity with the American Republic. Prior to the Civil War, most American sculptors lived and worked in Italy, including Harriet Hosmer, who you see here on the left, and Moses Jacob Ezekiel, whose work you see on the right. Both of them worked in Rome. They were then in proximity to what were considered the finest marble quarries and the most skilled marble carvers. Sculptures generally took the form of portrait busts or life size, or in the case of Hosmer's work, over life size, or bustling figures of mythological, historical, or literary subjects. And Hosmer, I should mention, was one of a small number of women sculptors who were working before the Civil War, and would be a great subject for a future talk for this organization. She was quite a fascinating character and had a very interesting life. So there was a small coterie of women sculptors who were active in Rome primarily in the years before the Civil War. Marble sculpture was expensive to produce and to buy, and thus collectors were limited, and patrons might acquire one piece. There were some who had large numbers of marble sculptures, but those were in the minority. Around the time of the Civil War, ordinary folk owned plaster casts of historical or modern sculpture, and John Rogers groups in plaster, like this one, Checkers Up at the Farm, sold through catalogs. And he's sometimes referred to as the Norman Rockwell of the 19th century, and I think you can get a sense of that here. His tight, realistic sculpture groups with folksy narratives form the common idea of what depicting everyday life and sculpture meant. Bessie Potter Vonnoh would become a leader among the sculptors who represented change, bringing more serious artistry and meaning to subjects from everyday life. The late 19th century saw a dramatic increase in the number of American sculptors, fueled by the demand for Civil War monuments and the encouragement of the great World's Fairs, which were encrusted with with architectural sculpture and awash in fountains, as you can see here. I'd love to teleport myself back to Chicago in 1893 to go to the World's Columbian Exposition. I feel like I've really missed out. Monumental sculpture, like the Augustus St. Gaudens you see on your left with William Tecumseh Sherman, which is in New York City, if any of you have not seen it. Monumental sculpture with its lofty moral content ranked the highest esteem in a hierarchy. Women were discouraged from making monuments, as monuments were, well, monumental, associated with the physical environment, required collaboration with workmen, and emphasized the body. There was also a belief among many of the male artists that women lacked the capacity for the big ideas required for the conception of monuments. And actually, St. Gaudens was quite vocal in stating these thoughts about women. He felt that they were very good at the technical things, but not so good at the big ideas. But the demand for monuments waned after the 20th century, after the turn of the 20th century, I should say. Now we're after the 20th century. The demand waned after the turn of the 20th century, and even more dramatically after World War I, and sculptors found themselves needing work. These are two beautiful examples of Vonnoh's sculpture, and I've included the dimensions, the height of these pieces in the captions so that you can get a sense of what the scale is. Sculptors began looking to sculpture for the home and the proliferating gardens for country estates and public parks, which were part of the City Beautiful movement, as an opportunity to make a living in their chosen profession. In the United States, the field of sculpture was professionalizing in these years. The National Sculpture Society was formed in 1893 to advocate for the use of sculpture and made the promotion of small bronzes and garden statuary central to its agenda. Charles de Kay wrote for the Society in 1898, quote, "The Sculpture Society looks forward with hope to the time when its finances will permit the publication of small limited editions of ideal statuary fitted for the adornment of the drawing room and the library, the merchant's office and the music room, the school and the boudoir." In 1900, the Sculpture Society held a forum called The Use of Sculpture in the Home and Its Surroundings. They promoted works that were lower in price, suitable for homes and pocketbooks of greater numbers of collectors, and raised the professional esteem within the profession for high quality sculpture for domestic environments. Yet there was still negative attitudes toward this type of work, and the artists who specialized in it were predominantly women, as their way was barred from the more prestigious monumental work, still the sculptor's highest aspiration. Monuments were still the repository of superior artistry and great ideas, and where the prestige and serious money were, rather than the kind of sculpture that in which Vonnoh specialized. So let's take a look at how Bessie Potter Vonnoh navigated this situation and devised an individual route to a successful career. This is her family. Bessie, so her name was Bessie Potter Vonnoh, as it's her married name, and I use that in this talk for convenience and in order to avoid confusion. But her name for the early part of her career was Bessie Potter. Bessie Potter was born in 1872 in St. Louis. You see her in the middle here, and grew up in Chicago. Her middle name was Onahotima, which was Choctaw for she gives with an open hand. Her mother had no particular association with the Choctaw Nation, but she found this to be an appropriate name for her daughter, and it proved to be rather prescient. Bessie's father was Alexander C. Potter, and actually he and Mary Elizabeth McKinney, her mother, were both from Ohio, but then moved to St. Louis. And he was a vendor of agricultural machinery. He died when Bessie was only 2 years old, when his carriage was struck by a train. So she was raised by her mother and her mother's family, and they moved from St. Louis to Chicago. And that was really to join her mother's family, and that was where she grew up. And she was kind of surrounded by people who were rather mechanical in nature, not by artists. But she was the only child in a home full of adults, and grew very poised as a result, and rather confident. She developed a penchant for modeling when she was in school. She started modeling in clay, as many of us do, in the classroom, and found that she was very attracted to the touch of it. Nevertheless, when she first started art school, she thought she might paint, but changed her mind. At the age of 14, she visited a plaster caster shop in Chicago with her mother. It was an Italian plaster shop, and she became very intrigued with what she saw there. And the proprietor of this shop introduced her to Lorado Taft, who was just starting out as a professor at the Art Institute of Chicago. And you see Taft here at your right, in the bottom photograph. And an early sculpture of Taft by Bessie Potter Vonnoh at the lower left. And there's another women's sculpture class at the Art Institute of Chicago, this one after Bessie had graduated. So she became a student of Lorado Taft, who took her on as a studio assistant at the age of 14. And he was Paris trained, which was important because Paris was becoming a mecca for the new generation of sculptors. They were no longer looking so much to Italy, but they were looking to France instead. He had trained in Paris and came back to the US to teach, which became very important for women sculptors who could study with French trained artists here in America, which was something rather new. And this opened a lot of opportunities to women, many of whom could not afford to study abroad. and also still had limited opportunities once they did. The École des Beaux-Arts, one of the major schools in Paris, did not admit women until 1896. So she wouldn't have been able to go there had she wanted to. So she studied with Taft at the Art Institute of Chicago, who had trained in France and learned about modern French sculpture. You can see on the modeling stand in this photograph of Taft, a kind of typical one of his works, which has these kind of moody, mysterious images of women with these sort of flowing hair and forms, were very typical of the kind of work coming out of Paris that he brought back to the United States. Vonnoh, in her early career, kind of announced her modernity with busts like this one of Taft, in which you can see that the bottom is very roughly finished. And this was very different than you would have seen in neoclassical sculpture of the earlier generation. So with this, she's announcing that she's a modern artist. I think you can also see in this piece what a wonderful likeness she could achieve. She was very good at achieving a likeness even during the early years of her career. So Bessie Potter Vonnoh was one of a group of women who became known as the White Rabbits, who worked as assistants on the sculptural decoration of the World's Columbian Exposition in the years before the fair. The Rabbits assisted with Taft's commissions and were employed to enlarge the sculpture of a variety of artists across the grounds, and of course attracted a lot of press and media attention, as well as the attention of everybody on the grounds to see these young women working on these monumental sculptures. And you can see a photograph of them in the center. The building that you see to the left is the Horticulture Building, was one of the buildings that Taft actually was commissioned to do the decoration for. So these were his groups. And you can see these big groups, the Sleep of Flowers, and another floral inspired group, allegorical group on the two sides of the door, and then this, a lot of other sculptural adornment. So these buildings were really covered with sculpture, and it took an army of sculptors to enlarge these pieces. On the right-hand side, you see Bessie Potter Vonnoh next to a monumental figure of art. It's an allegorical figure. She's holding a palette and a brush, which was her own sculptural commission for the interior of the Illinois State Building. There were a number of allegorical figures of the arts, and this was her assignment. She was also 4'8" tall, I should mention. So that gives you a little bit of, yeah, she's not quite as, the sculpture is not quite as large as you might think. But you can see her working with, trying to effectively create convincing draperies, and this kind of transparency of the draperies with this, what we call a contrapposto pose, which comes out of antiquity, where the raised hip on one side is balanced by the bend of the knee on the other. Whether or not you like the head or think that she's very good at it, I think she's still kind of learning. Plus, this was a figure that you wouldn't have seen at ground level. So I think that there's a kind of broadening of the treatment of the head in this piece because of that. But she's still a learning artist at this point. So the World's Fair provided an incredible opportunity for these women to gain practical experience with monumental public work. They made a boatload of contacts across the art world, and also got to see the art of 20 nations without ever leaving their own doorstep. So it was really an amazing experience. She was now qualified after this to make monuments and would occasionally enter competitions for monumental work. However, she soon discovered an individual and more personally gratifying road to success. After the fair, she remained in Chicago and took a studio in the Athenaeum building, which was a lively place, and started modeling statuettes of women in contemporary clothing for the fun of it. She then found that they reached an audience that admired the so-called new painting or impressionism, and these things caught on, and all of a sudden she was all over the newspapers. She achieved national fame for these works when she was still in her 20s, and later explained, quote, "I was determined to prove that as perfect a likeness and as much beauty could be produced in statuettes 12 inches in height and in busts 6 inches as could be had in the life-size and colossal productions suitable for so few houses. These things were dubbed potterines. You see one here. They were about 14 to 16 inches tall. She sketched them in clay and cast them in plaster, and then the plaster was tinted. And the plaster, which was the final medium, was really intimately associated with the delicacy of their aesthetic. There aren't very many of these extant because they are so fragile, but this one is in a private collection, and I'll show you another one at the Amon Carter in a moment. Friends posed to these initially, who visited her studio, and then she attracted prominent sitters for individual portraits at this size, including some of the most prominent families in Chicago, the Swifts, the Coonleys, and the Palmers. Vonnoh came to consider herself an impressionist. She was a modern artist and was seen that way by the critics. She wrote, "Like all young things, I was a radical in art. Greek sculpture didn't appeal to me at all. It seemed a far cry and cold. What I wanted was to look for beauty in the everyday world, to catch the joy and swing of modern American life using the methods of the Greeks, but not their subject matter." These works differed profoundly from what other artists were doing. Mythology, as you see in this work, McMoney's at the right, remained a very popular subject with sculptors. And with a wave of nationalism in the 1890s, sculptors also embraced distinctly American subjects such as wildlife, athletes, cowboys, and Indians. These were masculine subjects for artists who were almost exclusively male and white, of course. Vonnoh was an active participant in the nationalistic spirit of her day, but her work took a different twist. She became celebrated for these lively portrayals of American women. This beautiful example is at the Huntington Museum of American Art in Fort Worth. Contemporary viewers equated her imagery with types popularized by favorite illustrators, such as the so-called Gibson girl from Charles Dana Gibson that you see at the left. By 1895, Vonnoh acknowledged reading of her sculpture in such terms with titles such as The Summer Girl and The American Girl, which were popular types in the media. The contemporary, she modeled contemporary dress in her sculpture, which is one of the things that made it very distinctive from the ubiquitous classical draperies, and it became a mark of her modernity as an artist. So you see the balloon sleeves were kind of the fashion of 1895. In the press, her statuettes inspired words like chic, revolutionary, and even modern in the extreme. A more astute critic named Lucy Monroe described them as, quote, an inevitable expression of our character and habits, unquote. She exhibited these works at the Art Institute of Chicago, at the National Sculpture Society exhibitions in New York, at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and she sold nearly every one of them. The writer William Dean Howells and the American Impressionist painter Theodore Robinson were among the admirers that each bought one. Because she saw herself as a modern artist, Vonnoh chafed at the lifelong comparison of her statuettes with Tanagra figurines. Tanagra figurines was a household word in the 1890s, but it isn't something that we are very familiar with today. But they're little terracotta statuettes that came out of Hellenistic Greece. For example, this piece from the Metropolitan Museum of Art I'm showing you here at the bottom, which is about 6 inches tall, and they were depictions of daily life. These were discovered in the 1870s and altered the prevalent conception of Greek sculpture as austere and remote. They have a great sense of immediacy, and traces of coloration enchanted connoisseurs and the public. And as I said, Tanagra became a word that most people were very familiar with. The painter Childe Hassam, whose painting you see here on the screen, titled his painting Tanagra, reflecting and it reflects the prevalent idea that the meditation upon these statuettes could transport one beyond worldly materialism. And what you can't see in this painting, which kind of celebrates a world of beauty, she's standing in front of a Japanese screen, is that out the window there is actually a building under construction. Vonnoh was very much aware of this association, as you can get a sense of from this photograph of her posing with a statuette. She had a good sense of humor also, I should mention. But she was very much aware of this kind of association. Her work was understood to have a dual nature by its association with both ancient statuettes and with modern American life. The most poetic statement of this was made by Howells in a letter to the artist upon receipt of her work. He exalted, quote, "All that is chic, all that is Greek is in that lovely figurine. It is the oldest and newest beautiful. It is modern from the beginning of the civilized world. I ought not to adore it, I suppose, but feel there's something in it to be worshipped." A critic wrote more directly, "I would not imply that Miss Potter has consciously imitated Tanagra figurines, but her work displays that nationalistic feeling and that almost worshipful delight in contemporary existence, which is so rich a trait of the Greeks." The Young Mother and Girl Dancing are among her most acclaimed works and the first she cast in bronze. With works like these, Vonnoh became thoroughly associated with domesticity and intimacy and with ideal womanhood, which was a bit ironic as the role runs somewhat counter to her own position as the new woman, the professional out in the world. A Young Mother appears like a natural slice of life, but it's a very sophisticated, planned composition, in fact, in the orchestration of the raised and lowered limbs and its graceful lines. And I should say that the sculptor Alexander Mr. Proctor, some of you may be familiar with him because he did the buffalo on the bridge at Q Street Bridge in DC. His wife was a model for this particular piece. The piece showcases her elegant and fluid modeling. Girl Dancing shows Vonnoh's lifelong fascination with dance. She enjoyed dancing herself and cleverly shows here a popular form of social dance, a quadrille, as the girl bows as though she's bowing to a partner who you don't see. The skirt shows the real beauty of Vonnoh's modeling. It's suggestive rather than being descriptive and showing you the folds. In the late 19th century, preferences transitioned from white marble to bronze. Marble came to be viewed by many as cold, impersonal, and mechanical, while in bronze, the evidence of the artist's touch became seen as the expression of the artist's individual temperament and genius. In an article called "The Place of Sculpture in Daily Life," critic Edmund Gossa writes, "In bronze, we get very much nearer to the actual touch of the artist than in any other substance. That last light thumb mark behind the ear is there repeated forever in the unyielding bronze, and across the surface of the patina, we seem to feel the very breath of the master as he bent over his handiwork in the last act of creation." Of course, he says the master and he bent over his handiwork, but you get the idea. And one of the things that I think is, that I always get a thrill out of is when I'm looking at one of these bronzes and you can see a fingerprint. They replicate the clay model so beautifully. The taste grew for greater naturalism and textured or irregular surfaces like Vonnoh's that reflect light in a way that appears to palpitate. Most of Vonnoh's sculptures present interesting views from every vantage point and reveal the vibrancy and individualism of her touch. In the Gilded Age, there was great concern with decorative effects, and tastemakers believed that bronze was more compatible with the rich woods and sumptuous materials of the latest interior design. Bronze was also better lent itself to works of intimate scale than marble, as well as replication. Vonnoh didn't limit her additions, instead casting bronzes as ordered or desired for exhibitions. Her additions ranged from 2 to about 45. Variations from one casting to the next in details and in patina, which could be considerable, make each bronze, no matter how many, a unique work of art. And I think one of the things that's interesting, she used different foundries. The piece on the left, the girl dancing, was cast at the Gorham foundry, and you can see it almost looks like she's frosting a cake. It has very crisp edges to the modeling and textures, whereas the cast of a young mother from the Metropolitan was cast at the Roman Bronze Works foundry, has a much more fluid kind of appearance. And these are both made by the lost wax method. So within bronze casting, there can be great variation, both in texture and patina and other aspects. And the artist can actually make changes as well in the wax prior to casting, which can make each cast completely different from the next. We tend to think of Vonnoh's work in the context of the rich and ornate Gilded Age interior, a la Newport, but its sincerity and simplicity made it equally at home in this pared down Frank Lloyd Wright interior of the Chicago suburbs. And you can see on a plinth a plaster version of a young mother. This photograph was taken in about 1911 and is one of Wright's official photographs of the house. So you can imagine that he was involved in the placement of this sculpture, but Coonleys were patrons of Vonnoh for her work. Vonnoh's name became synonymous with images of mothers and children, much like the painters Elizabeth Nurse, whose work you see on the left, and Mary Cassatt on the right, both with examples from the Cincinnati collection here. Vonnoh's themes and their interpretation was often closer to what we see in paintings of the period than one sees in sculpture. Like these paintings, Vonnoh's sculpture was interpreted in its time as representations of the quote unquote modern Madonna, the angelic mother with its Christian associations and a long tradition in art history. As maternity and the home were at the center of women's traditional spheres, the theme of these artists rested on a subject they, as female, were expected to know, never mind that none of these three artists ever had children. They were definitely working professionals who put their careers at the foreground of what they were doing. The popularity of this universal and comforting subject with collectors and the press provided an inroad to acclaim for women artists. Vonnoh often drew on the work of painters for inspiration, this time from Whistler, who was one of those that she most admired. And you see Whistler's Symphony in White on the left and Vonnoh's Daydreams on the right. They both look to eclectic sources, including the sculpture from the Parthenon, these two figures that are now in the British Museum, rather controversially, you see at the top, which was the inspiration for both of these works. Whistler also looked to Japanese prints and the creation of a kind of shallow space, and you can also see the motif of a fan in his painting. And Vonnoh also, this is one of the few pieces for which the back is really not very interesting, and she's thinking about it in kind of a plainer way. This theme of two women lounging sort of sleepily on a sofa was one that other artists also took up and had a basis in the aesthetic movement in its portrayal of women as beautiful objects in luxurious surroundings, and the associations of women with ideal beauty and with art with a capital A. Vonnoh takes the theme into 3 dimensions in this tour de force of modeling, creating the feeling of interior space and indulgence in a work of 3 dimensions. Notice how she exaggerated the proportions of the bodies for aesthetic effect. If you look particularly at the figure on the left and look at her legs, the distance from her hip to her knee is rather extraordinary. This piece is now highly admired, but at the time of its exhibition in 1899, it wasn't fully understood and was considered quote unquote flimsy. And one of my favorite comments was a description of the draperies as quote, noisy like a game of basketball. So what some American critics sought in sculpture was quite different from what they sought in painting. They expected sculpture to avoid sensual pleasure in favor of serious intent, moral rectitude, and the classical tradition. Hence, Her Mothers and Children were more popular with the critics. They didn't recognize that it, like every good 19th century sculptor, Vonnoh did in fact reference the past here in the reference to the Greek Parthenon figures, of which she had a photograph over the mantle in her studio. In 1899, Vonnoh married the painter, well, Bessie Potter married the painter Robert William Vonnoh. And you see this portrait relief, which is that she did of her husband in 1901, which is kind of a rare example of her work in relief sculpture. She didn't do very many of those. He was a painter who shared her enthusiasm for Impressionism and respected her career, but nevertheless, it was not the happiest of marriages. Part of this was because he longed for solitude in the countryside in France, whereas she was really a city girl. She wanted to be in the city. She wanted to be among her colleagues and friends, and that was where she got her great stimulation. During the early years of their marriage, they lived at Rockland Lake outside of New York City for a few years, where she said she felt like a queen holed up in her castle, but also produced some of her most beautiful and famous works, including these two pieces, Enthroned on the left and Motherhood on the right. She explained later, for a long time, I had wanted to do things of a more ideal nature than I'd been able to do before. There was plenty of material at hand among the women and children of the village. One day, the barber's wife came to the studio door to deliver a newspaper. She had a baby in her arms and a couple of children clinging to her. There was my inspiration for motherhood. She was a Madonna-like type of woman, naturally sensitive and refined. A few years after, she died of overwork and too many children. To my sense, she's just as much a hero as any man who ever fought a battle. Surely in our parks where children play, there should be a few statues to motherhood as well as to warriors. She was rather ahead of her time there. We're finally catching up and starting to put up some monuments to women. The woman who appears in these two pieces, who was the model, was a woman named Helena Franz Walter, who unfortunately died in childbirth with child number 10. I had the pleasure of corresponding with her younger daughter, who appears in these two sculptures. The babies are both boys and are two different children, in fact, in these two pieces. The children in it, right, so these are not portraits per se, although they do have a kind of specificity to them to some extent. But Vonnoh was concerned with expressing universal ideas about motherhood. And if you compare them, I think you can see that they're quite different in what they express. Enthroned is very regal and elegant, whereas in motherhood, you see a mother who's very careworn and hardworking. The children in Enthroned represent three distinct phases of childhood, from dependence to independence. And the mother has a halo-like form on the chair behind her head. Increasingly, although she continued to make images of motherhood, Vonnoh concentrated on individual figures of women in graceful poses, like the one that you see here in bronze. This classicizing tendency we also see in modern dance with Isadora Duncan and her followers, who wore diaphanous classical dress and interpreted ancient Greek sculpture in modern terms. And Vonnoh, as I said, was always interested in dance. Vonnoh met Woodrow Wilson and his family at the Old Lyme Art Colony in Connecticut. Wilson's wife was Ellen Axon Wilson, was a painter, and they became friends. Vonnoh had a summer home in Old Lyme for more than 50 years, so it was an important place for her, and she met the Wilsons there one summer. The model for these two pieces was Jessie Wilson, who was Woodrow Wilson's daughter. She did work in marble from time to time, mostly for portrait commissions. And this portrait is an elegant example of her work in this medium, in which you can see that she simplifies detail, yet includes shallow carving of the pupils to give a sense of character. Jessie gave this portrait bust to her husband as a wedding gift. The Vonnohs went to the White House wedding of Jessie Wilson to Francis Sayre. And Vonnoh was also invited by Ellen Wilson to have an exhibition of her sculpture in the Red Room at the White House during the Wilson presidency. And I should say, this is kind of a curiosity. The painting by Elizabeth Nurse, I mean, it's just a funny coincidence. The painting by Elizabeth Nurse I showed you earlier belonged to the Wilsons and hung in Woodrow Wilson's study. Gives you a sense of their taste. Many sculptors augmented their income by designing bronze luxury items for household use and ornamentation, including bookends, wine coolers, and tobacco jars, among other forms. There was a brief vogue in the mid-teens for table fountains for the fashionable dinner table, which were recommended in House Beautiful and other magazines. In Arts and Decoration in 1916, a writer explained, quote, "The table fountain has become one of the most familiar centerpieces on fashionable luncheon and dinner tables, and it's being regarded seriously enough to enlist the best decorative sculptors in its design. Some of these were actually piped with electric motors that were concealed beneath the table. And they could be adorned with leaves and flowers. In this photograph of Vonnoh that you see on the right, she's arranging flowers in the basin for this piece, which was called the Intruder, because the maiden her bath has been intruded on by a little turtle that's on the opposite side of the basin. I always think it's kind of funny that the woman is a little hesitant about this turtle, but it's a rather beautiful piece. And this is an example at the Huntington Museum of Art in West Virginia. And there were several of these that were cast. In 1913, when she made this piece, she also made her first garden sculpture, and she soon specialized in such work. Between 1890 and 1930, there was a flourishing of garden ornamentation made by American sculptors. Before that time, American garden sculpture mostly consisted of European imports of mass-produced statuary, mainly English lead urns and the like, and Italian marble replicas after antique statuary. The late 19th century, wealthy industrialists seeking physical and spiritual refuge from the dirt and commercial world of the rapidly growing cities emulated the European aristocracy and established extravagant country seats in Newport and in Southampton on Long Island and in other enclaves. Architects worked in concert with landscape designers to plan gardens to complement the house, often in emulation of Italian Renaissance palazzos and grounds. And you have plenty of examples of that in Newport. Sculpture could be an effective way to give visual interest to a long vista, as you see in these two gardens, and entice the stroller in the garden to amble toward the sculpture to seek a closer view, directing the visitor's experience of the garden. One of the most perceptive and intelligent writers on American sculpture for the garden was the critic Mary Fanton Roberts, who wrote, "Sculpture holds an important place in garden designing. Aside from its intrinsic value as a work of art, it affords the most dramatic and effective climax to any garden picture. Particularly this is so in large formal gardens. There's no other means as important in creating a dignified impressiveness in a stately garden as marble and bronze figures significantly placed. In small gardens, charming pictures can be made with such devices as sundials and bird baths at the intersections of paths entwined about with roses or banked with fair lilies." Water lilies was Vonnoh's first garden sculpture, and it was also one of her most popular. She won an award for the piece at the Association of Women Painters and Sculptors exhibition in 1920. It's a small garden figure. It's 28 inches tall, and the kind of figure that writer for International Studio recommended. And Mrs. Gray, I feel that Mrs. Steele Gray, who read this, had this cast of water lilies in her garden, must have read this article. The writer says, "Serious mistakes have been made by using figures far out of scale with the surrounding garden. It's with very small statues that the most delightfully surprising effects can be arranged. Figures so small that they're hardly noticed until the visitor of the garden is almost face to face with them." Later, the author adds, "Some of the small figures look charming when surrounded entirely with flowers." Water lilies is indeed a charming piece, with the massing of the loose hair, of curls on the head, and the particularly sensitive modeling of the body. Vonnoh used artist friends' children as models for her sculpture. The model for this piece was Elizabeth Dumond, who was the daughter of artists Helen and Frank Vincent Dumond, who were neighbors in the studios on West 67th Street, where Vonnoh lived for much of her life. The model I was able to talk to at the time that I was working on my dissertation remembered that it was based on a photograph that Robert Vonnoh took of her at the beach one summer. And Vonnoh often used photography as a tool in her sculpture and sometimes took the photographs herself. This slide shows you variations between castings. The Corcoran's at the center has a very soft green patina, which gives you a very impressionistic feeling. There's a softness in the curls. The casting itself is less sharp than in the brown cast that you see on the left-hand side. It seems more ethereal as a result. And the modeling of the body is perhaps less legible than when a dark patina. So collectors, kind of develop their own preferences, whether you would prefer something sharper or softer, or green or brown, and would have those kinds of choices. The artist also had her preferences and sometimes stated those. Sprite is another one of these figures a little bit later from 1928. And you can see here that her child types are distinctively slender. They're not like the chubby Renaissance babies that you see in the work of some of her colleagues, like the sculptor Janet Scudder. And you can see in this photograph of the child model, who was little Beverly Maynard, again, a daughter of an artist friend. You can see the child with the model for the sculpture, with the clay model. And you can see how Vonnoh has slimmed down the child's protruding belly. Water lilies and sea sprite, like many works of American garden sculpture, were made by the artist on speculation. Sculptors sold them at commercial galleries, like the Milk Galleries in New York City that hosted annual exhibitions of garden sculpture, and at exhibitions of the National Sculpture Society and the Architectural League, where the artworks on view were offered for sale. Landscape architects or their wealthy clients would see the works there and choose them for a garden they were designing. Few artists made works that were commissioned and site-specific. Vonnoh was one of the relatively few to win commissions for garden sculpture. And in the 1920s, she completed 2 major commissions for public settings. This is the first of those. Vonnoh had friendships with leading naturalists associated with New York's Museum of Natural History, which was right down the street from her studio. And this led her to get this commission from the National Audubon Society for this piece, which commemorates Theodore Roosevelt's bird conservation efforts. It's at a bird sanctuary and was quite overgrown at the time I went to visit this piece. I'd love to see what it looks like now and whether they've cleared things away. It was not intended to be as left to nature as it was when I saw it 20 years ago. In this sculpture, children are feeding animals. And Vonnoh explained that she chose this subject because of children's relationship to nature and that she wished to convey the idea of service. She also explores in both this sculpture and the one I'll show you in a moment, relationship between 2 figures, one seated and one standing. You can see that the transparency of the draperies were a tour de force. And she was very interested in kind of conveying a sense of gentle movement as though it were blowing in a soft breeze. Vonnoh was concerned with the piping of these pieces for a slow trickle rather than dramatic water effects or splashing noises in order to complement the quietude of the bird sanctuary. The second sculpture, which took years to raise the money for, which is why it took over 10 years to produce, was a memorial to the children's author Frances Hodgson Burnett, the author of The Secret Garden. And this sculpture, if you've never seen it, is in the Conservatory Garden, which is at 105th Street. You enter at 105th and 5th Avenue, which is at the northernmost end of Central Park. And it's an absolutely beautiful garden and that many New Yorkers use for taking their wedding photos. And I highly encourage you to go when the flowers are blooming, because it is really very beautiful. This was a very prestigious commission for Central Park, and there was a lot of controversy around where in the park the piece was going to go, which is one of the reasons it took so long. And it's often said to represent specific characters from the Secret Garden, but that wasn't Vonnoh's intention at all. She was more attuned, again, to the harmony of children and nature. This wonderful set of images illustrate the development of her design from its clay model. At the left is a photograph that's in the archives of the New York City Art Commission of the little clay maquette to its completion. And one of the most striking things you'll see is that between this photograph you see in the middle of the clay model in Vonnoh's studio to the final version, she changed the girl's head. She changed her hairstyle from something that was very specific to the 1920s with this bobbed hair to something that was much more timeless and rather Grecian, that's kind of swept off of the head with a little band around it with curly hair. So she's creating a more timeless sort of sculpture in the final version. One thing I think is rather amusing is that the girl has these very transparent clinging draperies, whereas the boy, of course, is wearing clothes. Anyway, the final version has a more kind of timeless aspect, nevertheless, than the earlier version of the sculpture. And people keep stealing the little birds and they keep casting them and replacing them. So hopefully they're still there. She was a stickler for those kinds of details in her work. Robert Vonnoh painted this portrait of Bessie Potter Vonnoh in her favorite guise in which she dressed for costume parties as Vigée Lebrun, after the famous self-portrait of the artist from the 18th century. Vonnoh was conscious of carrying on the tradition of women artists of the past and really liked that association. After the 1930s, she continued to make sculpture, but she was not as ambitious. She mostly worked for friends, and few of the works ever made it into bronze. She taught in the 1940s at a summer portrait school in the Adirondacks and remained active until about 1952 when she had a stroke. She died in a New York studio in 1955 at the age of 82 and is buried in Oldham, Connecticut, where she had her beloved summer studio. By the end of her life, Vonnoh's style was outmoded. She lived to see abstract expressionism. It's kind of hard to imagine that, you're seeing these Gilded Age sculptures and then, the works of Jackson Pollock at this, but she lived to see that and had definite opinions about works of contemporary art, not all positive, although she liked the works of artists like Ed von Munch. Her works were relegated to museum basements until they began to emerge in the 1970s with a revival of interest in academic sculpture of the 19th century. But earlier in her lifetime, Vonnoh was very highly regarded contributor to American sculpture. She was the second woman to be elected member of the National Sculpture Society and among the first women in her field to be named to the National Academy of Design. And she also was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. This is a beautiful small size bust, which is kind of a 10-inch bust, which is a size she loved, which is in the Cincinnati Art Museum's collection, which we acquired in 1904. In her own day, Vonnoh set her own path. She earned a reputation as one of the most important sculptors of works for domestic settings, credited with raising the bar for the quality of small-scale sculpture for the home. She contributed to the viability of the sculpture profession, yet simultaneously reinforced the perception of small scale as inherently feminine. Small bronzes and garden statuary were intimate and frequently lighthearted. Critics wrote of Vonnoh's work as, quote, purely and obviously the work of a woman, unquote, or, quote, intrinsically feminine with never any affectation of the masculine manner, which was used as a way of putting down some of her colleagues. The excellence of women's achievement in these genres led them to be viewed as appropriate forms of sculpture for women artists. Vonnoh's specialization in quote-unquote feminine sculpture and her delicate touch contributed to her professional success in a field that was dominated by men. One result of her efforts she couldn't foresee was the appropriation of her achievements by critics to demean the work of other women who were struggling for success as makers of monuments. Nevertheless, with great determination, Vonnoh and the women of her generation opened doors for younger women who chose sculpture as a profession. And you can see this beautiful detail of enthroned. She never actually, demarcated things carefully. They're always very suggestive and impressionistic. So this is her great contribution to American sculpture. And I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That was wonderful. We have some great questions coming in already. So I want to remind everyone to put any questions you might have or comments in our Q&A section here on Zoom. I'm going to start with a question about her early life. As an only child of a widowed woman, how was it received by her family that she pursued a career, particularly a career as an artist?
It's interesting. I mean, they were middle class, but they didn't have a lot of money. And she always knew she was going to have to work. And I suppose the fact that her father had died and her mother worked briefly, but did not pursue a career. They lived with her mother's parents for a while and with her brother and his wife and children. So I think that there was an understanding that she was going to have to work. And her mother caused problems in her marriage because she lived with Bessie almost her entire life. And it did cause friction in their marriage. And I think that was one of the problems from the outset. And her mother had a very kind of dominant sort of personality, but she didn't seem to put any, she understood her daughter's decision to pursue a career and supported it always. And in fact, her mother tended to entertain her sitters. She did a lot of things that enabled Vonnoh to work. So.
Oh, that's good to know that she had a support system, whether or not it caused some friction in her life. I think many of us can probably relate to that.
Yeah.
With the famous portrait that William Merritt Chase created of Vonnoh, did they meet in Chicago initially, or was it a later encounter in their career?
We don't know exactly where they met, but it's interesting. She's wearing the directoire cap of the Vigée Lebrun portrait in Chase's picture too.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we know exactly where they met, but she certainly could have met him in Chicago.
Yeah, it seemed to have been a very influential crowd at the Chicago Art Institute of Chicago.
Yeah.
Could you provide a sense of how much her small scale bronze sculptures might have cost at that time period? Maybe what the contemporary conversion might be?
Well, I mean, they were like $25 is what some of them cost. I mean, $25, $50, something like that. I don't know the conversion off the top of my head, what that would have been. You can look it up online and there are websites that will tell you what that is now. Yeah.
Well, that is interesting. It's as if, well, as you've stated too, or more or less words, it's as though she's trying to make sure that art with a capital A is being included in the home in many different ways.
Exactly.
Substantially within the home. Do you know of any of her works on public display in Chicago? We must have a Chicago attendee here. Something that I guess maybe outside of a museum.
There aren't any public pieces outdoors. She may have assisted Taft with some things he was doing at the time. There were plenty of Tafts outdoors in Chicago, but a lot of those that he did with his women students came after she had graduated already. The Art Institute of Chicago does have her sculpture, but I have to say sometimes it's not out, which surprises me. But they have several pieces, and the Terra Foundation, which no longer has a museum, has actually a lovely piece too.
Oh, that's interesting. Good to know. Yeah, she seems to be collected amongst most encyclopedic institutions in urban areas. So hopefully wherever our viewers are, they'll be able to see a piece of hers.
Yeah.
This is specific to Frances Grimes. Although we know that, Vonnoh's not from Ohio, but Grimesy was a principal assistant to Augustus Saint-Gaudens, and they both lived in New York City, that being Vonnoh and Grimes.
Right.
Do you know of any connection between the two artists?
I don't know anything specifically. She was very, she knew a lot of the other women sculptors, but, there isn't a lot of documentation. I know she knew Harriet Whitney Frischmuth. She probably knew Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and through her involvement with a variety of these organizations like the National Sculpture Society, she would have met just about everybody, but there's no correspondence. There's correspondence between her and Daniel Chester French. Some sculptors, there is correspondence, and we know he admired her work because he bought it for the Met when he was involved in forming their sculpture collection. But there's no specific, we don't know anything specifically about an association with Grimes.
She had a meeting with or knew Rodin. Is that correct?
Yeah, she visited him in the studio in France. In Paris, yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if that had any influence on
She
her
went
work.
to Paris in 1895 and spent the summer and visited a lot of the major sculptors at the time. And she was a great admirer of Rodin's work.
You can see that in some of the more dramatic drapery in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can in her handling sometimes too. It's the connections are more subtle than but they're definitely there.
Although you mentioned a few of them, could you repeat for our audience which foundries she used, and if you have any inclination as to why, other than geographic location?
Her primary foundry was Roman Bronze Works, which was founded in around 1900, and she used them for most of her work. But she did sometimes shop for other foundries, and we don't, there's really no documentation as to why she would cast, some of the same designs in different foundries. She would sometimes go to Gorham. She sometimes went to this foundry called Graffoul, which was in Newark, New Jersey. And sometimes I think she was looking for less expense. And the Gorham bronzes are astoundingly beautiful. They're some of my favorite castings of her work. But Roman Bronze Works had this Italian immigrant named Bertelli, who she worked very closely with and trusted greatly. So she tended to work, I think she worked mostly with them. They became a very fine, a lot of American sculptors worked with them. Her earliest works, the earliest casts of the young mother were sand cast. And there's a wonderful, I should say, and I should have said this earlier, there's a great essay on Vonnoh and the bronze foundries in our catalog written by Janice Connor. It's kind of a complicated issue. Some sculptors were very deeply involved in the casting process. At times, Vonnoh seems to be more concerned with it, and other times she kind of she would tell them what she wanted and she wouldn't go out there and they would just do it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, and I should say for our audience, just did a quick Google search. That catalog is still available for sale on the internet. So see if you can find yourselves a copy.
We have them available from the Cincinnati Art Museum shop.
Oh, good.
If you don't find it on eBay or something, yeah.
Yes, visit the Cincinnati Art Museum on their website. I'm sure you'll be able to get one sent to you.
We have them. You can call our bookstore. You can get one. Yeah.
Perfect. With her long tenure and residency at Old Lyme Art Colony, could you discuss a bit about her pursuits as an instructor and what artists she may have influenced in participating in the art colony there?
Well, she didn't do a lot of teaching. It's funny. She taught a few friends to sculpt, but she wasn't, and she taught at this portrait school in the Adirondacks that was started by Wayman Adams in the 40s, which I was kind of surprised to find when I started doing research on her. The lights just went out of the offices around me, but thankfully not where I'm sitting. So she, she was, I think she was influential, no question. And she was influential, and I think, but some of it is not, it's not spelled out as much as, you're kind of, you can see that there are other artists starting to make portrait statuettes of these small scale figures of women and children that I'm sure we're looking at her work. Abyssinia Eberly is one of them. And, while her work is very different, you can imagine that Vonnoh's would have been important for what she ended up doing.
And one of those works that you shared with us, Water Lilies, I noticed that you had it in the Corcoran collection, but since the Corcoran collection is no longer extant, you know where that piece ended up. Was it the National Gallery, perchance?
I don't think that one went there. They took most. They did take most. So Vonnoh gave her estate to the Corcoran. They gave her her first retrospective was at the Corcoran, and she always felt that it was important for her work. It was, it still was connected to the art school. And she felt that it was very important that students have access to her work. And so between the art school and the fact that she was indebted to them, that was where her estate went. And they made their first selection of works from her estate that they wanted, and the rest of them were distributed or sold. And so the Corcoran had a significant group of them in the National Gallery. When the Corcoran's collection went to the NGA, they made a selection as to which pieces they wanted, and they took quite a few of them. Then the others were intended to be distributed to other Washington area museums. And I have to say, I just didn't have a chance while I was preparing this talk, to figure out where water lilies had gone. What you can't see in the picture is that the lily stem was broken. So I have a feeling that, whoever has it may want to repair that. But that is an issue with that particular bronze, which is something that happened somewhere along the way. So in any case, it's one of those things. But it is kind of nice. I love the comparison of it with the brown castings, because it does have a very different effect.
Well, I guess that also leaves with her legacy is that in choosing her estate to go to a gallery that had an art school with it, that just says a lot about how she wanted to continue to educate in the manner of sculpture past her lifetime, and she certainly has.
Yeah, she thought about her legacy.
Yeah, well, we're grateful for it, and we're grateful so much, Julie, for you for giving us your time this evening and providing such an enlightening talk. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Julie, for coming and joining us all the way from Cincinnati. It's been a pleasure to have you with us this evening. And again, everyone, please make sure to stay tuned to see what we come up with next for our Winter 2022 lecture series. And until then, be well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.